The crowd fell silent. Everyone expected the police to arrest her, the woman being evicted from her own home. Even Harold Wilson stood there with a smug grin, already savoring her humiliation. But when the officer looked straight at him and said, "Mr. Wilson, you are under arrest," the world turned upside down. Shock froze on his face. The crowd gasped. Cameras captured everything. And then something happened that no one saw coming. But let's start from the very beginning. This channel won't survive without your subscription and likes. Help me! The heat hung over the streets of Atlanta like a boiling cauldron. On the porch of her worn but cozy home sat Lauren Carter, an African-American woman in her 40s, with an energetic gaze and a tired smile. She let the evening breeze brush against her face as her 17-year-old son, Marcus, played with his younger sister Kaylee on the lawn. The house they lived in was their last refuge. Since her husband's death, Lauren had done everything she could to keep a roof over their heads. But their landlord, a wealthy, elderly white man named Harold Wilson, clearly didn't want them among his tenants. He nitpicked constantly, fabricated lease violations, raised the rent without notice, and repeatedly threatened eviction. But that day, Harold crossed the line. Pulling up in his silver Cadillac, he stepped out, clutching a stack of documents. His gray hair was neatly combed back, and his face bore an air of smug satisfaction. His eyes, cold, piercing, filled with disdain. "Your time is up," he declared, shaking the papers in front of her. "You need to be out by the end of the week." Lauren rose to her feet, arms crossed. "We have a valid lease, Harold. We pay on time. You have no grounds to evict us." Harold smirked. "Oh, I'll find some. You know, I have connections in the city. The local authorities don't like, let's just say, undesirable families around here." Marcus clenched his fists. "We're not leaving. This is our home." Harold shot him a dismissive glance. "You really think anyone cares what a kid like you has to say?" Anger burned in Lauren's chest, but she knew losing control wouldn't help against men like Harold. Then suddenly, her eyes fell on a copy of the documents in his hand. She noticed something strange. The night was long and restless. Lauren sat at the kitchen table, hunched over a pile of documents, tears blurring her vision as she read each page. The only light came from a small desk lamp, casting shadows on the walls, like ominous warnings of what was to come. The air was thick with the scent of paper, ink, and her own fear. And then she saw it. Her heart clenched when she reached the signature on one of the papers. The handwriting. It looked familiar, but it wasn't hers. She held the document closer, trying to convince herself she was mistaken. But the truth was undeniable. Harold Wilson had forged her signature. A crude imitation, but enough to pass. Lauren's fingers curled into a fist. He had stolen their home. She flipped through the other documents. According to these falsified papers, the Carter family's lease had been voided, and the house had been transferred entirely into Harold's possession. Which meant... She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, feeling the pulse of horror and helplessness pounding in her skull. He hadn't just tried to evict them, he had made sure that, in the eyes of the law, they were the trespassers. Illegal squatters in their own home. Lauren knew her only option was to fight back. The next morning, she stood before the towering doors of the municipal courthouse, clutching a folder of documents like a lifeline. The city administration office, housed in a grand marble building, loomed over her like an impenetrable fortress. At the front desk, a receptionist peered at her through a glass window, sighed, and took the papers. "You'll need to speak with a judge." Lauren waited over 2 hours before being called in. Inside a cramped office, buried in paperwork, sat a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit. The judge skimmed through her documents, then laced his fingers together and shook his head. "Ms. Carter, I understand your situation, but there's not enough grounds here to proceed with a case." Lauren felt the ground slip from under her. "What? But this is forgery. That's not my signature." The judge sighed, shrugging. That's not within my jurisdiction. You'll need to take this to the real estate department. But by the time I get through the bureaucracy, he'll throw us out on the street. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do. His voice was flat, distant. He spoke as if she wasn't even there, just another case, another complaint to be dismissed. Lauren felt tears stinging her eyes. She walked out of the office, gripping the document so tightly that her knuckles turned white. They were alone in this. When she got home, Marcus was already waiting for her. Well? His voice held a flicker of hope, but the moment he saw her expression, his shoulders slumped. The court won't take the case, Lauren whispered. Marcus spun around and stormed onto the porch. So that bastard can't even be stopped by the law? Marcus, they're just going to throw us out like garbage. He clenched his fists. Because we're not the kind of people they want living here. Lauren stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug. I won't let that happen, she whispered, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair, trying to bury her own fear. Marcus's chest rose and fell sharply, but after a moment, his muscles relaxed. Still, no matter what she told him, she couldn't shake the growing sense of doom inside her. The next morning, after another round of fruitless calls and visits to city offices, they returned home, only to find it sealed shut. Lauren stopped in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. A massive sign hung on the door. Illegal occupants. Eviction in effect. The windows were boarded up. A single box of their belongings sat on the porch. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the scene. Kaylee clutched his hand, too young to understand what was happening. Lauren gazed at the home they had lost, not because they had done anything wrong, but because someone decided they didn't deserve to stay. Her soul felt like it was being torn apart. Lauren was not the kind of woman who gave up. When her world collapsed, when everything seemed lost, she gritted her teeth and found a way. Sitting on a cold bus stop bench, clutching her phone, she dialed the one number that could save her family. Jennifer. Her voice trembled. She hated sounding like this. Tired, vulnerable. But if there was anyone who knew how to fight even when the odds were against them, it was Jennifer Hall. Jennifer had been her best friend since high school. A tall, fair-skinned woman with short chestnut hair, she had dedicated her life to civil rights. Over the years, she had won numerous cases involving unfair evictions and discrimination. When Lauren told her about the forged documents and the eviction, Jennifer's voice turned to steel. This man thinks he can do whatever he wants because he's a respected property owner. But the law is on your side, Lauren. We have a way to bring him down. But he bought the judge, Lauren whispered, exhausted. A judge is not the whole system, Jennifer said firmly. We'll take this higher, where his connections won't help him. For the first time in weeks, a spark of hope ignited in Lauren's chest. Jennifer took the case with the passion of a true activist. She started by filing official complaints with the housing department. Then she reached out to the press. When the authorities ignore the people, we make sure the whole world hears about it, she said. And it worked. News of Lauren and her children spread across social media. Within hours, a post about their unjust eviction gathered thousands of comments and shares. People were outraged. Are you kidding me? This is straight-up racism. Does anyone have contacts in the media? This needs to be on TV. We have to help this family. The next day, a crowd gathered in front of the Carter's house. Neighbors, activists, journalists. People held up signs that read, "No justice, no peace. Housing is a right, not a privilege. We will not let this happen." Lauren looked at all these people and felt something growing inside her. Strength. She was no longer alone. Then, Harold Wilson arrived. Pulling up in his gleaming Cadillac, he parked right in front of the crowd. He stepped out with his usual smug smile, confidence etched on his face. To him, this was just a spectacle. He didn't even acknowledge the protesters, treating them like background noise. He walked straight up to Lauren, then turned toward the approaching police officer. "Officer!" Harold's voice was loud, commanding. He pointed at Lauren. "Arrest her! She's illegally occupying my property!" The crowd erupted in outrage. Journalists fell silent, cameras rolling, capturing every second. The officer, a stocky man in his 40s with a firm expression, slowly turned his head toward Harold, his gaze cold and unreadable. Then, for a moment, silence. And then he spoke. "Mr. Wilson, you are under arrest." The air froze. The crowd fell silent. Harold blinked. Then he let out a nervous chuckle. "What? This is ridiculous." But the officer was already pulling out the handcuffs. "We have evidence of fraud," he said flatly. "You forged legal documents, attempted an illegal eviction, and violated the state's anti-discrimination laws." "This is a lie!" Harold exploded. But two more officers were already stepping toward him. The crowd roared. People pulled out their phones, recording every moment. Someone shouted, "Justice has been served!" Lauren couldn't look away. She watched as Harold's hands were forced behind his back as he struggled, as he shouted about his connections and false accusations. But none of it mattered anymore. Lauren exhaled. After weeks of pain, fear, and despair, hope had won. The crowd was silent. In front of dozens of people under the lenses of countless cameras, Harold Wilson stood as his crimes were read aloud. "What?" His eyes widened, his voice shaking with rage. "This is absurd!" But no one came to his defense. None of his respected friends from the city council. None of his business partners. He was alone. The officer continued reading the charges, and Harold's world collapsed around him, each word striking like a hammer. "We have proof of fraud. You falsified legal documents. You abused your power." The crowd murmured. Some shouted. Others just watched, recording, witnessing the fall of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. "Serves you right," someone yelled. "Justice wins today." Harold tried to protest, but his words were drowned in the noise. He struggled one last time, but the cuffs clicked around his wrists. An officer shoved him forward, leading him to the squad car. "You can't do this. I'll sue all of you," Harold shrieked, his face turning red with fury. But his words no longer mattered. Lauren stood on the porch of her home, gripping the railing, her heart pounding. This felt unreal. Just a week ago, they were on the verge of eviction. Yesterday, they were homeless. But today they had won. She felt a small hand slip into hers. Marcus stood beside her, his eyes glowing with pride. He looked up at her and, for the first time in a long while, smiled. "We did it, Mom," he whispered. Lauren ran a hand over his head, struggling to hold back tears. "Yeah, baby, we did." Reporters swarmed around her, shoving microphones forward. "Ms. Carter, how do you feel right now? What's next for you? What do you say to others facing injustice?" Lauren took a breath. She could have said so many things, about the fear, about the pain, about how easy it was to lose faith in justice when the world was against you. But instead, she looked at her children, at their tired but hopeful faces, and said, "This house is ours, and we're not giving it up for anyone." Lauren's story spread nationwide. News outlets covered it. Papers wrote about it. Television hosts debated it. People who had once stayed silent in the face of injustice found inspiration in her fight. Social media flooded with comments. "She proved you should never give up. This is a victory not just for her family, but for all of us. Finally, justice prevailed." As for Harold, he lost everything: his reputation, his business, his wealth. When the court found him guilty of fraud, the real estate empire he had built crumbled. The man who had once dictated the fate of others now found himself on the other side, and no one felt sorry for him. But this was never about Harold. Lauren's story was one of strength, of resilience, of justice. And if even one person saw it and realized they too could fight back against injustice, then it was all worth it.